As of today, the Chicago Bears have over $7 million more in salary cap space than they did yesterday. So we'll take a look at some current free agent options that Ryan Poles should take a look at.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. Join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. And make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today and hopefully every day. On the show today, we follow up on yesterday's podcast, looking at the new salary cap space that the Chicago Bears have now that we are past June 1st, and we'll dive in more specifically on free agent options available to them, guys on the market that have been sitting on the market that maybe the Bears have been interested in, but just haven't had the space to do so, or maybe sort of been waiting to see how this current roster practiced at OTAs to get a better sense of the guys they do have before looking at some of these potential outside free agents to now add into the group that they know their own guys a little bit better. So we'll look at some wide receivers, some offensive linemen, the two biggest positions of need, and we'll wrap up with some other key players at positions across the roster where the Bears could stand to add a little more depth and some players with some familiarity as well. So if you haven't heard yesterday's podcast, that lays a little bit of the foundation for today's podcast as to why it is today the Bears have a little more than $7 million of extra salary cap room compared to yesterday because we are officially post June 1st. If you want the details on where this new salary cap money is coming, go back and take a listen wherever you're listening to this podcast right now or watching on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, because that'll kind of catch you up on the logistics of how we got to this point. But now all of a sudden, there's a little cash in the Bears' pocket here, and perhaps that pool of free agents looks a little bit wider now that there's a little bit more flexibility financially to maybe, up an offer here or there, or to compete more so financially with maybe a certain player or available option that has been waiting for a team to come with the right market. Right, some of these players that are still free agents are waiting for the right opportunity, and then if a team has a certain need that becomes available later in the process, like via an injury or whatever, all of a sudden now that team would be willing to pay more. So now while the Bears have more of this salary cap space, they could add, for example, another wide receiver for Justin Fields. And I think the one that Bears fans have already seen it on Twitter have circled a little bit in free agency right now still is Will Fuller, another one of these speed vertical downfield threats that would play into Justin Fields' skill set in terms of being able to launch the ball deep downfield. He spent most of his career with Houston. He was in Miami last season, but barely played. I think there might have been an injury involved in that. But, we know he can still run. He's still only 28 years old, just turned 28. So there's a lot left in the tank, it seems, for Will Fuller. He's not known for having the world's best hands, but we're not talking about signing a true number one wide receiver, but an experienced, productive complement here, potentially for Darnell Mooney. Otherwise, you look around this wide receiving group, and it's a lot of really aging NFL receivers that I don't know would have all that much incentive or motivation to want to come play for the Chicago Bears. Because, yes, we can all look at this Bears team and see they're not really competing for the Super Bowl right now. This first season under Matt Eberflus, that's not a realistic goal for this team. So like Julio Jones at age 33 probably was looking more for a chance to win a ring. Or, Cole Beasley is another one of these older names. Deshaun Jackson, Danny Amendola, even Odell Beckham Jr. recovering from his injury. He's looking for those bigger opportunities to win, and maybe the finances aren't going to be as significant of a motivation for them. If anything, if you're looking at a veteran player, Chicago would be that opportunity potentially to come to a team maybe for a 1-year deal, try and have a big season in that 1 year, and then cash in the following season or get a better opportunity the following season. So maybe somebody like Adam Humphries, formerly of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, I think he was with Washington last season, more of a slot receiver, has always been that sort of like 400 to 700 yard a year type of player in there. Otherwise, if you want to find the coaching staff connections for free agent wide receivers, certainly, T.Y. Hilton would know Matt Eberflus, but I think, again, with him, it's more in that Julio Jones category of a 32-year-old receiver who's maybe not necessarily purely ring chasing at this point, but not in this position where he's so desperate for a gig that he would just take whatever Chicago might offer him. Same thing with Emmanuel Sanders, because when he was with the Denver Broncos, the Bears wide receivers coach Tyke Tolbert was his wide receivers coach there. And so there's certainly a connection that could entice him for Chicago, but at age 35, does he have any real on-field motivation to play for what the Bears are doing this season at wide receiver and with this offense, and where things are kind of going in the immediate short term, because he's very much in a short-term window for his career. There is another Colts wide receiver out there, Chester Rogers. He's been kind of a end of the depth chart type of guy who's rotated in. Some connection there then to Matt Eberflus if you wanted to add another one of those options, but not quite as exciting or as proven or as consistent as a Will Fuller or maybe an Adam Humphries. But we've also thrown Allen Hurns out there as a guy who hasn't really played in the last couple of seasons, but earlier in his career with the Jacksonville Jaguars showed a lot of promise and had some really strong production with Allen Robinson, of all people, in Jacksonville. But otherwise, there's not young quality wide receivers still on the free agent market that might want to join what the Bears are offering. So many of the guys are not only 30 plus, but 33, 34, 35, 36 type of age range. And I just don't know that a ton of them exactly line up for what the Bears want to do and fit where they are in this stage of their career, unless it's somebody like Will Fuller or Adam Humphries that might fit more in this, take a 1-year deal, reprove yourself to the NFL, and then cash in either with Chicago or another team after this upcoming season. I think the market is much more robust along the offensive line, where the Bears have what still feels like a massive hole at right guard and maybe could use some more experience and competition at offensive tackle. We'll look at a few options across the board with some real, I think, quality names and experience, including some coaching staff connections as well. Next on Locked On Bears. Well, this time of year, it is wedding season, and that means the ladies in our lives are going to be looking at the jewelry. They're going to be thinking about proposals, and our friends at BlueNile.com are going to be your best spot for not only wedding jewelry, but just everyday fine jewelry, diamond jewelry, cocktail rings, gemstone necklaces, then, of course, engagement rings and bands as well. And you got to do it right. And our friends at BlueNile.com will make sure that you do it right, because they're the largest online retailer of certified diamonds and fine jewelry. They have jewelry experts on hand 24 hours a day via phone or chat to help you find a memorable gift at every budget. Simple online tools that let you choose the diamond shape, size, and clarity, as well as the setting style. So each ring is one of a kind for that special person in your life. Make your moment sparkle with jewelry from BlueNile.com. Locked On Bears listeners get $50 off purchases of $500 or more. It's a podcast exclusive that includes engagement rings. Use code LOCKED ON. That's code LOCKED ON for $50 off. Plus, every order is insured, ships free, and arrives in discreet packaging that won't give away what's inside. Shop stress-free and find your forever piece. Go to BlueNile.com today. If the Chicago Bears do still want to upgrade their offensive line, and I think we can all agree that they should still want to upgrade their offensive line, this free agent market still has starting caliber talent available, really, I think, at all 5 offensive line positions. I do wonder if the Bears currently are in that position to feel like they want to immediately upgrade the offensive line, given that they haven't. You know what I mean? This hole at right guard existed, all offseason, through the draft, post-draft, right? Even after the draft, they did add a couple of other wide receivers in Tajay Sharp and Dante Pettis that we talked about on the podcast. Not proven, surefire wide receivers, but still more depth at that position. And the offensive line additions have been more like, Dakota Dozier and Julian Davenport. And of course, 4 rookies and then Lucas Patrick early in free agency. But I mean, more recently, it's been, Sean Coleman and Julian Davenport at the tackles that are not like starting caliber, surefire, bring them in to upgrade the offensive line guys. And so maybe this increase of $7 million in cap space that clicks in today, it will be the difference for them to, okay, now we can sign this offensive lineman that they've been interested in. But I also wonder if maybe they're still in wait and see mode on this offensive line. We'll get into the prospects here in just a sec, or the options here in a sec. But like we've heard all offseason from Ryan Poles and Matt Eberflus about, questions about the offensive line. And they've sort of repeatedly said, during these OTAs and mini camps and stuff, they're not in pads. So we don't really truly get to see what they can do. We see that they move well or whatever, but it's not really a true representation of their actual ability. So I do wonder if maybe Ryan Poles and Matt Eberflus would have some propensity to say, let's wait until training camp. Let's see Larry Borum with the pads on. Let's see Tevin Jenkins with the pads on. Let's see Sam Mustipher at right guard right now with the pads on. And then decide, okay, definitely need to upgrade or maybe don't need to upgrade. But it just seems like I would prefer that they be more proactive and make it more a competition than just waiting and seeing and perhaps, waiting that extra, 2 months here before training camp really gets rolling will remove more of the free agent options from the board because there are still a pretty solid group of starting caliber players available. I think near the top of the list, and perhaps the top of the list for me, might be Darrell Williams. He's been, I think last year he was the Bills, well, he kind of bounced around a couple positions for them, but started at right tackle, played right guard, and really filled in at both spots, and across a couple seasons in Buffalo. Earlier in his career in Carolina, he played left tackle for them. He played some left guard for them and some right guard. So I think he's literally in his career played all 4 of the non-center offensive line positions. And I just think that could be so valuable for what the Bears need on their offensive line right now, to where, if you want to plug in Darrell Williams at right guard, great. It'd be a surefire upgrade over Sam Mustipher, who's still kind of learning the position. If for some reason Sam Mustipher really settles in at right guard and is playing great, he could compete at right tackle with Tevin Jenkins or at left tackle with Larry Borum, or you could move Larry Borum then to right tackle and have the 2 rookies compete at one spot, or move one of them inside the guard and have them compete with Sam Mustipher, right? It seems like Darrell Williams would have the experience, the consistency, and that bonus versatility to give you some extra options in training camp as you see these players and create competition maybe at 3 separate positions, because he can play all 3 and you do have players that seem to be able to play, or at least you can try playing at multiple positions. So I would be curious about Darrell Williams' availability, who might be waiting for that true starting role, but maybe a starting role with a contender, but he's still under 30. So you could see 1 year in Chicago, play really well, cash in next year, that type of thing as a possibility, a motivation for him to play for the Bears. Or how about J.C. Tretter from the Cleveland Browns? He's been their starting center for the last 6 or so years, and the Bears have already locked in Lucas Patrick at center, it seems, this offseason. But Tretter, early in his career with Green Bay, and Luke Getsy, we should say, he played left tackle for them a little bit as a backup, played guard there as well. I think he would prefer to be a center because that's where he has played at his best over the last 6 seasons, where he's probably been most comfortable. But if you want Lucas Patrick there, I think you could get J.C. Tretter to play guard and play at a decent level there. And whether that's the left side or the right side, or maybe some versatility there too, I think Tretter would be a solid option. And because I think he was released by the Browns, well, we're past the compensatory pick formula calculations anyway, so you don't even have to worry about when the player was released or how they became available. Other guard option, I think, again, near the top of the list, Eric Flowers. Kind of was a bust for the Giants early in his career, but spent the last couple seasons in Washington and with the Dolphins at left guard, and seems to have sort of settled in and found a home there. I don't know if it would be too difficult to ask him to switch over to right guard, even though he's kind of settled in at left guard, or would you move Cody Whitehair over? Regardless, give me a starting caliber guard, and I'll figure out how to put them all in there later on in the process. But I think Flowers is still in that younger side of the spectrum that you could more easily convince him to come to Chicago, compared to the Jason Peterses of the world that might not want to just join any old team at the end of their career if they're at least looking for some opportunity to maybe win and get some real playing time for them. And I think Flowers and Treader and Darrell Williams are all sort of in that young enough group to convince them in that way. As far as offensive tackles go, I think you got to have Eric Fisher in the conversation because of the Matt Eberflus connection, right? He was the Colts left tackle last season along with Julian Davenport, who actually filled in for him with the Colts. And so it'd be a fun sort of reunion that way. But Fisher, very clearly starting caliber player at that spot, and same kind of thing. Plug Eric Fisher in at left tackle, move Larry Borom to compete with Tevin Jenkins at right tackle. Maybe the loser there could even kick inside to right guard. Potentially, you could try him out there and compete with Sam Mustipher. There's that ripple effect still on this offensive line if you add somebody who can play the offensive tackle spot. And I don't want to, ideally, move Borom again and then move Jenkins again, or make 3 players change positions. But at least if you do it early enough, they'll have some time here to kind of settle in and gather those roles a little bit better. But these guys all kind of seem like in that range of like quality, consistent enough starting caliber player who might have needed a little bit more of a financial incentive to join the Bears than just whatever close to minimum contracts the team has been able to offer free agents for the most part in the last few months since free agency. But that bonus $7 million of salary cap space, I think, is going to come in very handy. Could allow them to go after, I wouldn't call it a luxury, but maybe some positions that aren't as massive needs as wide receiver and offensive line, but could still use additional depth and maybe have money to do all of the above. We'll look at some of the other top free agent options the Bears should consider elsewhere on the roster next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at rockauto.com. They're a family business that have been serving auto parts customers online for over 20 years. They have got the deepest catalog of car parts anywhere you can find on the internet. It's incredible. I mean, parts that I don't really understand what they do, but I do understand that I can get a great deal on them, and they're easy to find, right? Despite such a deep catalog, you just enter in your car's make and model and boom, pulls up all the different parts for your vehicle, and you can sort by the brands, specifications, and prices that you prefer. Some stores will have different price tiers for professional mechanics versus do-it-yourselfers like us, but rockauto.com's prices are the same for everybody. So don't spend up to twice as much for the same parts somewhere else. Head on over to rockauto.com today and see all the parts available for your car or truck. When you check out, fill out their box that says, "How did you hear about us?" and let them know the words "locked on" so they know we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices. All the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. I don't want to get too loose with the $7.2 million of cap space that the Chicago Bears have added today. You don't want to go crazy and try and just get whatever kind of splash free agent you want there. I mean, not that you can afford everybody, but I do think the priority should be offensive line, right guard, and wide receiver. But if you can work the money well enough and maybe afford, a couple of players and, depending on what the price range is going to be, you could maybe look to a couple of other spots that you definitely don't classify as nearly as major of needs, but it'd be fun to see the way they could fit into this, mainly on this defense, but maybe even another spot on offense as well. Like we floated out this offseason a couple of times, this idea of like maybe the Larry Ogunjobi thing isn't fully off the table. When the Bears voided Ogunjobi's contract because of the injury, they said we are not going to sign as a result, we will not be signing Ogunjobi today. The last word of that sentence was today, period. They could have just said, as a result, we are not signing Larry Ogunjobi, period, but we are not signing Larry Ogunjobi today. Kind of left the door open. It's like, well, what about tomorrow? Or more so, like, what about in 3 months from now? Like, if that foot injury heals up and he is able to then pass a physical, could they sign Larry Ogunjobi again? And obviously, at this point, it would be a much more reduced contract than what they would have paid him in March, but you'd still be getting, in theory, the exact same player for a fraction of the price. It could be a great deal to add that kind of rotational value to this defensive line where you can never have too many players that can rush the passer and clog up the rushing lanes there in a 4-3 defensive line. In a similar vein, Sheldon Richardson is still sitting out there, and I could see him, he's kind of been that 1 year at a time mercenary for whatever reason, where, he hasn't really stuck on with a team over the last handful of seasons in his career, he bounced around between Seattle and then Minnesota and then Cleveland for a couple years and then back to Minnesota this past season. Not that he's going to be some sort of stellar game changer at age 31 now, but 1 year in Chicago, mercenary type deal. Not going to win a Super Bowl, but could bounce back type of year and say, come to Chicago, play your heart out, and go cash in again next season, get one more big contract late in your career. I could see that type of potential motivation for somebody like Sheldon Richardson with some versatility. The Vikings last year in their 4-3, they played him at that 3 technique defensive tackle, but then sometimes in nickel situations, they would move him to a defensive end as an edge rusher on the outside and go with a bigger kind of package and rotate some different things that way as well. So I think Richardson could be a fun option for the Bears. Although, again, I imagine he might be a little bit more Super Bowl winning focused than next contract focus and waiting for that next sort of Ndamukong Suh-like opportunity for that team that just wants to sign him and add some extra juice to their defensive line. One other name on that line I would throw out there, Carl Nassib from the Las Vegas Raiders. If you want more edge rusher depth for this Bears team, especially when the Robert Quinn trade speculation, I don't know if we can even call it trade rumors, but it's hard to know exactly what's fully true and not true about how long Robert Quinn will still be in Chicago, but clearly it's not going to be for the long run. Maybe it's this whole season, maybe it's the trade deadline, maybe it's training camp, he gets traded, but regardless, Robert Quinn will not be a Bear for all that much longer, it seems like. So, adding somebody like Carl Nassib into that defensive end rotation with Al-Qadim Muhammad, with Travis Gibson, potentially with Mario Edwards Jr. or Jeremiah Tauchu and Dominic Robertson, who they drafted, why not another one of these younger players with some upside there? The motivation to come to Chicago then, play really well, cash in, right? That's the pitch. It's not so much Super Bowl and winning this season, but getting that opportunity to prove yourself along with everybody else on this Bears roster. They still also kind of need that third linebacker with Roquan Smith and Nick Morrow. So Anthony Hitchens from the Chiefs is a guy that's been floated out a lot this offseason. Used to play for the Colts in Matt Eberflus's defense as well. There's clearly an obvious connection there if this is sort of the opportunity he wants, but being that number 3 linebacker is not even barely a starting role anymore in this defense, so maybe it's not quite the group he might be looking for. Or another former Colt that I keep floating out this offseason, Xavier Rhodes at cornerback, the former Minnesota Viking. It sounds like from everything we've heard that Alan Williams and Matt Eberflus love Xavier Rhodes. Of course, the Bears drafted Kyler Gordon and Jaquan Brisker, and Jalen Johnson's going to be your other starting cornerback, so maybe there's not that role for him anymore, but we certainly haven't seen all the love in the world for Jalen Johnson in Chicago, and I don't know if Rhodes would want to be a backup or if there's an opportunity there to somehow rotate these cornerbacks in some way, but it just seems like that there's been such a strong coaching staff connection to Rhodes that I always just keep him in the back of my mind is that an option that we might see at some point down the line? One other fun luxury name I'll throw out there that probably wouldn't be the most, frugal use of resources, but what about tight end? Eric Ebron, formerly of the Detroit Lions, was with the Steelers the last couple of seasons, I think, but was hurt for most of this past season. So really didn't have that production this past year. I feel like there was a time in free agency when, not this year, but in previous years under Matt Nagy, when Ebron was linked to the Bears as a potential option in some way, shape, or form. Obviously a different regime, no lingering connections there, but a pass-catching tight end to pair with Cole Kmet and some of the other veteran blockers that they've really had this season. It's not to really take a lot away from Kmet in terms of targets, but just add that real true Jimmy Graham replacement. More tight ends, more weapons. If you can't find a wide receiver you like to pair with this group to upgrade Fields' pass catchers, how about a tight end that's had some pretty productive seasons as a pass catcher that could come in and offer another weapon just in a slightly different way than that true wide receiver that still feels like a pretty big need. So I keep that one in the back of my mind too. I think Ebron said earlier this offseason that the knee injury he suffered last season has fully recovered, so he should be, in theory, good to go. I wouldn't guess that's in the cards for the Bears right now, but you got a little extra salary cap space. Another weapon for Justin Fields, just not in the traditional way. I'd kick the tires at the very least. So a lot of different options there for the Bears. Some guys defensively there, some really solid offensive linemen, and a little bit more sparse at wide receiver. We'd love to hear what you want the Bears to do with that $7.2 million in salary cap space? Let us know in the comments on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel here on this video. You can tweet us at Locked On Bears. You can comment in the Locked On Bears Facebook post or in the Locked On Bears Facebook group where the discussion is always going along. And I hope that you're subscribed to Locked On Bears wherever you're listening to this podcast or following along on YouTube. That's the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We are your team every day here on the Locked On Podcast Network, and we want to hear from you as well. We put together a survey so we can learn more about listeners like you and make your favorite Locked On podcasts even better. It's your opportunity to tell us what you like and don't like about Locked On Bears and all the Locked On podcasts. If you want to partake, you go to lockedonpodcasts.com/survey right now to get started. Doesn't take very long, and everyone that completes the survey is entered in for a chance to win one of 10 $100 Ticketmaster gift cards. Those could be football tickets, concert tickets, $100 to spend on tickets at Ticketmaster. lockedonpodcasts.com/survey for your chance to win. Appreciate you tuning in. Appreciate you following along throughout this offseason. And I hope that in exchange, the Locked On Bears podcast makes it that much easier for you to bear down.